Greetings, my name is Fierce Blue, and today I am going to tell you everything you need to know about tanking in Final Fantasy XIV in my ultimate guide to tanking. Something I've been asked time to time is tanking hard? Well, really, no, tanking is actually not very hard at all. But I will say tanking is incredibly visible. Your mistakes generally are put on pretty big broadcast. People will notice when you die. People will notice if the boss isn't positioned correctly. But you mustn't be afraid to make these mistakes. They're going to happen. No one picks up anything the first time as an expert at it. You must be ready to accept constructive and valid criticism, and you must generally have a drive to improve. There are a lot of additional resources besides this video too, some of which I will go over at the end of the video. Not as much a tip as just general advice in this game that applies to all roles, whether they be tanks, healers, or DPS. Make sure to read your tooltips. After this video, and a little bit of practice, you'll soon become the expert tank that everyone wants to have in their party. So without delay, let's get right into it with our first tip. Be sure to manage Enmity. Every tank in the game has a tank stance that allows them to generate way more Enmity than any other role in the game. If you are the only tank in a party, you should make sure you have this on. However, for trials and raids, generally only one tank will have their stance on at a time. For AoE packs and mobs and dungeons in particular, the devs made it really easy for you to generate threat quickly across multiple enemies. Your basic AoE combo, which all tanks have, do more DPS on 2 or more targets than your single target rotation. So it's really easy. As soon as you see 2 targets in a dungeon, just start hitting your AoE combo. To help with this too, you also have a UI element that shows every enemy and what they are currently aggroed to. When you are the tank role, red icons mean those enemies are aggroed onto you. You want to make sure that all enemies are aggroed onto you when you are the only tank. If one is not, you can also use this UI element to select the remaining target that is not aggroed, and either press your provoke button or use a ranged weapon skill to get that enemy back onto you. Then you can continue to AoE to ensure you do not lose enmity across all of the targets. For dungeons and normal raids and trials, this will be sufficient. However, for both Extreme, Savage, and Ultimates, something called a tank swap will be necessary. You will notice on the party list little bars beneath each job icon. This indicates current level of enmity against the target. The target who currently has threat will have a red bar underneath their job icon, with the target with the second highest enmity will display as yellow. In this way, you can see how close you are to gaining control of the aggro on the target over the main tank. Tank swaps are needed when a lethal amount of damage would otherwise be dealt to the same target if nothing were to be done. When the boss is starting to use its tank buster, be sure to use provoke during the cast. This will make you the number 1 target and put you on top of the enmity list. The main tank will then use an ability called Shirk that will give a certain percentage of their enmity to you. Of course, if you are tanking, then the off tank will provoke and you must use Shirk on the off tank so that they can have a significant lead in enmity. Most of the time, what I will do for any fight is I will keep my stance off if I am the off tank, and then I will turn it on about 45 seconds to a minute into the fight. This allows the main tank to gain significant lead in enmity. and that way I don't have to worry about managing turning it on or off. If there ever is an issue and I don't have Shirk or Provoke available, then I can just turn stance off if I'm getting too close to overtaking the main tank in Enmity. The second big tip I'm going to tell you is make sure to deal as much damage as you can in this role as well. Tanks are capable of doing quite a lot of damage. In fact, both tanks together can do as much damage as one DPS, sometimes even more. There's absolutely no reason to not do a rotation correctly and take advantage of this. Thankfully, most tank rotations are not very complicated. The first important thing to know to ensure that you're always doing as much damage as possible is ABC. This stands for always be casting. You should at every point in time ensure that your GCD is rolling, or that you are always pressing something and there is no moment where you are not pressing a button and doing a damaging ability. Even if that damaging ability is a low potency ranged weapon skill like Tomahawk or Unmend, it is still better than absolutely pressing nothing. The next thing I want to talk to you about is something the Final Fantasy XIV community calls greed. I'll start off by saying greed is good. But above all, make sure you are ultimately respecting mechanics, especially when you are progging on a fight for the first time. But let me provide you a scenario. Let's say the boss is about to cast a big AoE with a telegraph, and that AoE is going to go off in about 5 seconds. It makes no sense to leave as soon as he starts casting and spending 1, 2, or even 3 GCDs away from the boss. If it lasts for 5 seconds and it takes you 1 second to get out, then you can safely get off 1 more GCD at the very least, perhaps a second depending on how large the enemy's hitbox is. Something that I have been told before is, well, how much difference can 1 GCD make? There are 2 problems with this mindset. 1, if everyone justified tiny, small percentages as to why they're not doing as much damage as they could be, those percentages add up, especially when you wipe by less than a percentage point due to an enrage. The second problem with this mindset is it's ultimately self-defeating. Why wouldn't you want to optimize everything you can? What's the point of trying to get better in the first place? Finally, another important detail about doing damage as a tank is understanding raid buffs. Just about every job in the game, besides tanks, white mages, sages, samurai, machinists, and black mages, provide a raid buff that increases everyone's damage for a short period of time. Many of these occur at the 2-minute mark, so on pull, 2-minute mark, 4-minute mark, and so on. An important detail of doing damage as a tank is ensuring that you do not drift your 1-minute cooldowns, and that you are conserving resources for those 2-minute marks. So for example, as a Dark Knight, you want to ensure that you are pooling mana for when raid buffs appear, so you can use as many Edge of Darkness as possible. If you accidentally drift your cooldowns, then what will happen is you will not only do less damage, but the people who are using the raid buffs won't have as much utility, since a lot of their power comes from buffing other people, including you. The next big tips revolve around, well, the most important part of tanking, perhaps, is dealing with incoming damage. Let's talk about EHP, or Effective Health Points. What is EHP? Well, let's just say you have 100 health points, and you use a mitigation that reduces all damage taken by 30%, something that all tanks have. Well, you could think of it as having effectively 130 health points before you die. That is EHP. And it is an important topic if we're talking about how to use your cooldowns effectively to deal with incoming damage. Because in this game, there are 3 different ways of dealing with incoming damage. There is mitigation, there is healing, and there are shields. Mitigation just simply reduces damage taken by a percentile amount. It is important to understand that percentile mitigation do not stack as effectively as they might seem. So, for example, if you were to use a 20% mitigation and a 30% mitigation, that does not necessarily equal 50% mitigation. They stack multiplicatively. You are about to take 100 points of damage. That would be concerning. The way that the math will work in-game is it will take that 100 damage and reduce it by 20%, and then it will reduce it by an additional 30%. So, you'll take 80 damage, and then it will reduce it by 30%, for a total of 40 points reduction. That is not quite 50%, as you can see here. That being said, there will be occasions where you will want to stack percentile-based mitigation due to surviving something, or maybe because there's no other reason not to. Healing is something some tanks have capability to do for themselves. And of course, healing is something that has to be done after the fact, or else you will overheal. This can be nice on occasion when you take a lot of damage, but you can restore your own health, so a healer doesn't have to pay attention to you and heal you with a global cooldown, but rather they could focus on damage. Finally, we have shields. These are temporary sources of additional HP. The cool thing about shields is they stack extremely well with percentile mitigation. So, let's think about it this way. Let's go back to EHP, or effective health points. If you had 100 health points, and you got a shield for 25% of your health, you have 125 health points. And then, it effectively gets multiplied if you were to use a 30% mitigation. The point is that shields and percentile mitigation stack with no loss in efficiency. For dungeons, thankfully, the damage coming in is never too aggressively high. Bosses in dungeon do not hit very hard at all. Most of the damage comes from pulling multiple packs, which our cooldowns are good for. Most of the damage is at the very beginning of the pull. That should make sense because that's when the most enemies are alive. So you want to use your big mitigations at the start of a pull. Think back to effective health points. When a lot of enemies are alive, we want our effective health to be very big. So that's why we're going to use our mitigation there, healing, and shields. But make sure to save some for the next pull. Using everything at once means that they will all fall off at the same time, and you will suddenly take spiky amounts of damage, which the healer will not be equipped to handle. Also factor in that there are different types of damage. There are magical sources of damage and physical sources of damage. This is particularly relevant if you happen to be playing Dark Knight, which has a lot of defensives focused around mitigating magic damage. The easiest way to see what kinds of damage bosses do is by quickly going to FF logs and looking at damage taken. But a good rule of thumb is just about every AoE in the game is magic damage. For dungeons, remember that Arm's Length is an additional cooldown that every tank has access to. On a 2-minute cooldown, Arm's Length will slow enemy melee attacks by 20%. And this is considerable, especially used with any other mitigation. The enemies are not only attacking 20% slower, but they are also doing 30% less damage. There's no reason to not use this in dungeons to make it easier on your healer. In fact, I personally use this along with my 30% on the very first pull of the dungeon when I go wall to wall. as all tanks should. The reason I do this is because the 30% mitigation and arm's length have the longest cooldowns, so I want to use that as many times as I can in the dungeon, because they are the strongest cooldowns. The slow portion of arm's length does not work on bosses, however. An important topic is healer attention, as I call it. The idea is you want to use your cooldowns effectively, because the consequence of not doing so, even if you manage to stay alive, is you'll be taking up a lot of healer attention. The healer has a limited amount of off-global cooldown abilities that they can use to heal you. If they run out, they will have to start using GCD abilities, which means they will start doing less damage. And as I mentioned before, damage absolutely matters. Tanks also have methods of reducing the damage everyone takes. The first method is an ability called Reprisal, which will reduce the amount of damage a target can deal by 10%. This is considerable. You have 2 tanks in any raid, and the damage coming out in a raid is very high. So this can be alternated in such a way that an AoE can be reduced in damage every 30 seconds. This saves the healers a lot of effort and should be used to deal with mechanics. Finally, all tanks have a unique method of reducing damage taken, whether it be Gunbreaker's Heart of Light, Paladin's Divine Veil and Passage of Arms, Dark Knight's Dark Missionary, or Warrior's Shake It Off. Be sure to read the tooltips on each of these and use them in appropriate situations. All of your defensive abilities are off the global cooldown, which means they can be used effortlessly while still dealing full damage. Another important thing to understand is using your damage reduction cooldowns to cover multiple damaging events. So let's just say, for example, the boss casts an AoE and then immediately follows it with a tank buster. You could use your cooldowns on the tank buster alone, or you could use your cooldowns early to cover the AoE and also the tank buster afterwards. A skill that's particularly good for this is Rampart. It is a 20% damage reduction that lasts for 20 seconds, which is a very large period of time. You could use Rampart to cover a series of auto attacks from the boss, and then a tank buster afterwards. Or, let's just say you're going to go ahead and use your party-wide mitigation to cover not only the tank buster you receive, but maybe the AoE shortly after. These optimizations are definitely on a fight-by-fight basis, so be sure to pay attention at the cast order that the boss uses, and see where you can further optimize. Immunes in this game have a particular use, in order to allow, say, execution of a strategy that would otherwise kill a player, or to save cooldowns for later in the fight by using an immune to solo tank a tank buster. The last thing to be very vigilant about is something called the server tick. Every 3 seconds, the server will check data and values. So, if a boss is about to cast an AoE or a tank buster, you can't put up your mitigation at the very last second. You must ensure that your mitigation is up about 2 or 3 seconds before the cast or action finishes, or else it will not be calculated correctly. You may have noticed this before, say if you had a shield on you, or a shield put on you at the last second, and you noticed you took damage through the shield, or if you used an immune and you still died. That was because the server did not calculate that you had this shield or immune on at the last second. Next, let's talk about boss or enemy positioning. Positioning is important for one big reason. Well, actually 2 big reasons. The melee need to be able to hit the boss and perform positionals, aka they need to be able to hit the back of the boss or the side of the boss depending on where they are in their rotation. Secondly, you'll need the boss in particular areas in order to execute mechanics. Sometimes, the boss doesn't reset their position to the middle of the room, so you have to be careful. As you can see in this clip, an example of allowing a boss to stay stationary for the melee's gain, is where I go over here to avoid this attack. As soon as the attack resolves, I move in and immediately stand back at that front pointer marker on the boss. So now the boss will not move or pivot in direction, so the melees can predict that they will be able to execute their attacks in the same location and do more damage. As I said earlier, this is not a whole lot more damage, but every percent counts. And why wouldn't you care about optimizing? For dungeons, and dealing with large packs of enemies, things do become a little bit easier, but there are some tricks you can do. Namely, using sprint right before you enter combat allows sprint to last for 20 seconds rather than 10. Because using sprint in combat makes it last for 10 seconds only. So what you will want to do in any dungeon pull is cast sprint right before the first enemy aggroes on you. And as you approach, you will want to then use your first AoE. That way, you can quickly grab threat on everything and move and kite without taking too much additional damage. This will allow you to easily perform wall-to-wall pulls, which is expected of you as a new tank. We have the ability to mitigate and deal with the incoming damage of multiple packs of enemies. Another trick is if you are approaching a pack of enemies and one of them is very far away, such that you will not be able to hit all of them with your AoE, you can use Provoke on the furthest target, so it starts to walk towards you first. This works because Provoke's range is 30 yards, much higher than, say, a weapon skill such as Tomahawk or Unmend, and Provoke is also off the global cooldown. Finally, when you get all enemies gathered up, you want to move a little bit past them and then directly into the middle. What this does is it bunches all the enemies together in what I will refer to as a death ball. This allows for efficient AoE usage from your 2 DPS in the dungeons. My last tip is, well, you know what, just have fun. But always look to improve. It doesn't matter if you parsed 100 on a fight, or otherwise made no mistakes. I guarantee you that there is a way to do something better. Even I could look at every fight that I've done and notice about 10 different ways I could have done something better. The tools that I use to improve myself are as follows. One powerful tool I use is called Ffxiv analysis. This website is kept up to date by the best theory crafters in this community. You can post your log to it, identify what your character is, and then you will be given advice on how to improve on any fight, as well as what you did well on that fight. If Ffxiv analysis doesn't quite give you the answers you're looking for, you can also look on FF logs and sort through the data yourself, to see if you can find any ways you can improve there. Do not be afraid to receive constructive criticism from people. They most of the time want to see you do well, because having you do well helps them do well. Most of my information today does not go into specifics about different jobs. I do not talk specifically about warriors, dark knights, gunbreakers, or paladins. A lot of the specific information in regards to your openers, your rotation, your gearing, or more can be found on a Discord server called The Balance, which I will link in the comments. The Final Fantasy XIV community can be very supportive at times, so don't be afraid to go out there and make mistakes. As long as you're willing to show an earnest attempt to improve and become better, then many people will greet that very excitedly and will be willing to help you reach new heights. That is all I have for today. I really hope you guys like the guide, and if you do like the guide, be sure to like this video, comment, and subscribe. You can also find me on Twitch. Have fun, and be safe out there.